Okay, we can begin. Good evening. As you know, I don't need any introductions for this audience. It's the 3 weeks. I always pick something, try to every year pick something that's relevant to the theme of the 3 weeks or tragedies in Jewish history, which is no shortage. And this year, obviously, it occurred to me a while ago to do this theme about the 1881 pogroms, which are the first pogroms really in Russia. And that's the reason many of you are in this country, because they ran away starting at that time. And therefore, that's why I entitled it, the title of the series is Harbinger of Catastrophe or A Blessing in Disguise. So for those who didn't leave and stay to the Holocaust, obviously, the pogroms of 1881, I know I'm dealing with a somewhat knowledgeable crowd, is a foreshadowing of the Holocaust. It's the first time you have physical violence in a big way in the modern era against Jews. That's a statement I just made. It's interesting, right? You didn't have pogroms in Germany, in Austria, in France, in England, in places like that. We're too used to rhetorical overkill, in which, yeah, there's pogroms everywhere, everything's a Holocaust, you know. We live in the age of Obama and Trump, you know, everything's rhetorical overkill, to the left or the right. But in point of actual fact, the 1881 business, although it's not exactly the first pogrom, but first really important set, and it was not characteristic, it's not characteristic of Russian history either, or a harbinger of what was coming not that much later, because Hitler's 50 years later. So that's just a broad way. But anyway, just for a purpose of recording, the title of this series is The Russian Pogroms of 1881, Harbinger of Extermination or Blessing in Disguise. Tonight is the first of the lectures, and I think it's called Czars and Jews. And our sponsor tonight, as you can see, is the Berlins, who Sherry Berlin told me she wanted to do it in memory of Mrs. Steinhardt, with whom she was close. Many were, who passed away not long ago. And we were just talking yesterday, completely unexpectedly, you know, it didn't occur to me, Mrs. Leigh Steinhardt was from Eisenstadt. And we were actually there last week. And Sherry Berlin's like the only other person I know in Baltimore who's ever even heard of the place. Because, not for his, but because, well, her father's from there. And Mrs. Steinhardt's father was last Rav in Schlesinger in the 30s, up to the Holocaust, up to the Anschluss actually. Then he moved to Palestine, and that's why she knew Vrit. This is what you call, as you can see in this book over here, Eisenstadt's one of the Sheva Kehillas. Maybe you've heard that expression, okay? But nobody actually knows what the Sheva Kehillas are. You can remember the members of the baseball team, but you don't know what the 7 Kehillas were. But Eisenstadt's the main one. This is in the area between Austria and Hungary. And the funny part about it is that there are a number of people here tonight who were on our trip to Eastern Europe, to Central Europe the other day, and I don't usually do Kavarim trips because I'm a Kohen and that's not what I'm into. But you can't go to Prague and places like that and skip the Kavarim either. So I told everybody they should go in and daven there and so on and so forth. And as a result, the people on my trip who were not Kohanim got to visit and pray at some of the most famous and celebrated graves in the history of our people. You think of Prague and the Moralno, the Yehuda, people like that, and in Nikolsburg, where we were at, and where we stopped at, and in Eisenstadt, and Vienna, and Budapest. So just take it from me, a lot of famous names there of the past, if you know a little bit about Jewish history. And in the town of Eisenstadt, which is today in Austria, but until First World War was part of Hungary, it's on the border. So that's actually was the first, if you know Jewish history, that's where the first Hungarian yeshiva was, which later on grew to 100 of them. And that's in the 1700s and associated with Rameir Ezra the Panamira. So he's a famous name from the past, although I always deal with famous names no one's ever heard of. And so the graves are usually neglected and falling apart and that sort of thing, as you can imagine that part of the world. But my wife and everybody went to daven there, Panamiras, and they saw it's a big fancy schmancy grave. His, not the others. And look, if you read closely, it's put up by Donald Trump. I kid you not. So I know some people are now going to have a moment of extreme cognitive dissonance. Okay, now let it be. But there, so put Donald Trump. And my friends, this is huge. Okay, so you find the most unusual sort of things as you go romping through graves. Go to the next one. That's usually the neglected state of the others. So I don't know why he fixed up the Panamiras and all that. Obviously, he was approached by somebody. But it's just interesting what you discovered. Let me put it this way: I was in shock. With that intro and with that tribute, part of the Berlins to Mrs. Steinhardt, who all of us remember, I'll begin my remarks by pointing out something that's not so common for Americans, and that is Poland and Russia are two separate places, okay? Let's go to the first map. They're not the same. And everybody thinks Eastern Europe, all Slavs and all the rest of it. They are Slav, but they're very different. And the Jews were in Poland, they were not in Russia throughout history, okay? We did this last year, 2 years ago, about the Jews in Poles. So here is the historic, what you see over here, this is the kingdom of Poland of yesteryear. Today it's separate countries, but I've spoken many times, so it's not possible for you not to know what I'm talking about. The kingdom, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that existed until the 1700s, that's where the Jews were. And that's where our ancestors were. And that's where all the Torah and the Yiddishkeit and all that business was. And that territory is big. So it comprises pretty much everything you see today. So today this is a separate country called Ukraine. This is separate called Belarus. This is separate called Lithuania and Latvia and so forth. This is Poland proper. Here's another map. This is not Russia. Okay? Russia's there to the east. It's not Russia. No Jews in Russia. Okay? No Jews in Russia. So that's what I'm going to start out by saying. Russia is not Poland. Poland's not Russia. The history of Russia, not Poland. History of Russia is no Jews. And they didn't want them. And if you go back to Ivan the Terrible, which is in the 1500s, what do you see over here? You read this, and he drowned when he captured the town of Kazan. If there are any, this was a Muslim-held town, and therefore there were Jews in there. Any Muslim-held territory, you'll find Jews. And he killed them. He was a converter, he killed them. You can convert. No, it's not Hitler. You can convert, but no Jews, no Jewish Jews in Russia. It's a virgin territory, holy territory, and not to be polluted by the presence of Jews. So there's Poland and there's Russia, and don't confuse the two. Now, therefore, the history of Russia, which is very different than that of Poland, developed along lines of no Jews, military organized state like the Ottoman Empire. There used to be these rulers of a small town called Moscow, maybe you heard of it. And then what happened is they just expanded in every direction. They conquered a little more territory here, a little more territory here. Once in a while they lost, but eventually they caught a little more territory here, until you get the whole big shebang of Russia. That's how they operate. That's the only way they understand. And it worked for them, because they went, as you know, from the Atlantic to the Pacific in their way. So in the process of doing this, as I say before, you had to have a military organized state. So the nobles and all the others were there to supply the czars with military, force of soldiers and that sort of thing. And it worked. I forget, some Russian statesman in the 1500s, when they were all still primitive, said the foreign policy of Russia is to extend itself in every single direction. It was easy. Now, even when Russia started to westernize a little bit, which is called Peter the Great, who I think everybody's heard of, and he's famous for being very cruel, but also westernizing, made everybody change their clothes, change their religions, change their habits and all that. Even he didn't want Jews in there. Peter the Great had converted Jews, okay? So his mother was actually from a Jewish background, believe it or not, Karaite, anyway. His prime minister, or one of his big prime ministers, Shapiro, but he's a Meshumad, he converted, his father converted. And this guy was a Sephardi, a Portuguese Jew, in one of these picaresque situations, ended up as chief police or something for Peter the Great, They're not Jewish Jews. They're Christians already. So the Russians aren't racist like Hitler, and never have been. It's interesting, never have been. It's not a Russian trait. They're willing to take everybody in, provided you become part of us. But on the other hand, even Peter the Great would have no regular Jews. Look at the next line. Let's go to the next one. Oh, we didn't have no? Well, forget it. Let's put it this way. Regular Jews, he said, I don't want any tricksters or cheaters in my empire. Now, yeah, if you know anything at all about Peter the Great, he wanted the monopoly on tricking and cheating himself. But nevertheless, that's who he was. But nevertheless, even he was approached by, if you know anything about Peter the Great, he went to the West on inspection trips, and he spent years in Holland and England and places like that, talking to people like Sir Isaac Newton and others, trying to give a veneer of civilization to his barbaric interior. And because he said that's what Russia needs to do. And they told him over there, they said, if you bring in the Portuguese Jews or the other Jews, they'll build up the economy, all the rest of it. Oh no, they'll take advantage of all the Russians, and they'll own the country. I mean, Peter the Great. Yeah? So it's not Poland for the 10th time, it's Russia. Right? But on the other hand, if you know who Peter the Great was, he did conquer a couple of provinces in the West, what we today would call Estonia and Latvia, Courland and places like that. And these are the territories that he conquered from the Swedes, who used to own it, and there were Jews here. So as a result of the conquest of Peter the Great, he started to have a little bit of Jews in one little area, and they were there from before. Well, that was too much. By the time to get to his daughter, who becomes the empress, a few rulers after him, a few poisonings afterwards, Elizabeth, she kicks all the Jews out. Right? She said, I don't want a shava pruta from the killers of Christ. It's a very famous line that she said. Right? She can't stand it. So there are no Jews in Russia. And then there are, and that's the story. Right? And how'd that happen? I thought you don't let anybody in. That's true, but Russia took over Poland. So from the anti-Semitic point of view, they swallowed a hornet's nest. Because if you take over Poland, you get the Poles and the Jews. That's the booby prize, right? Now, we talked about this before. There used to be a large kingdom of Poland, and it was eventually divided three ways, but the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, she's the one who got the lion's share. She got like 90%. So now you understand what I'm talking about, when the Tsarist Empire took over 90%. So they got a big nerve for the last couple hundred years saying the Jews entered Russia and trying to take over the country. Jews didn't enter Russia, you entered Poland. And you took us over. No. That they're allowed to do. But you have the right to be against the Russians or not Russianize. Why the heck should they Russianize? They're not Russians. But this is the rhetoric that you get in Eastern Europe. Now, Catherine the Great was the cleverest of all the czars. And if you know anything about her at all, she combined, a very interesting person, she combined the realpolitik of Machiavelli with the PR face of liberalism. She didn't want to be, the Russian rulers, especially Peter and Catherine, people like that, and it's very important for our story, for some reason always conscious of how they appear to the outside world. They wanted to appear all positive. And they weren't one of these rulers who say, I'm bad, the heck with it, you don't like it, drop dead, They weren't like that usually. It really bothers them if people look at them as evil or cruel or something, even though they are. And so keep that in mind. Catherine the Great is very much like that. She presided over an empire that had millions of slaves. She was pretty ruthless. She knocked off her husband, as I'm sure many people know from the movies. She knocked up a lot of other guys also. And in general, she ran a tough show, but conquered a lot of territory. And she was able at the same time to present the face of an enlightened despot to world public opinion. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, and she invited all these people to their visit Russia. If you go to the Hermitage and these other palaces, it looks so fancy and Baroque and Western and nice. And you get the idea, she's Catherine the Great. But really, she was a tough son of a gun. But she wasn't Russian. She was a German princess who maneuvered her way to become the Empress of Russia, and then she Russianized. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because she's going to have a somewhat not regular Russian attitude towards the Jews. She's not Russian. What I'm trying to get across is the old Russians, the Jews are like cancer. We have nothing to do with them. It's the Greek Orthodox. The Catholic world, the Protestant tradition is to be fascinated with Judaism, even if you hate it, because Jesus was Jewish. The Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, is not to be fascinated, it's to be totally repelled by it. And she wasn't exactly Russian. But she takes over this whole territory, as I just said before. As you can see on the map over there, there's a tremendous expansion to the west. That's why she's called Catherine the Great in the Russian history books, because she had a huge amount of territory to the west. First of all, in Europe, and also from the Turks. She kicked the Turks out of Russia, the Ottoman Turks and the Tatars. She took them over. So the Crimea and all those areas that Putin was taking, she's the one who conquered it. A bunch of long wars. So in the process of moving everything in the west, you get all the Jews of Poland, which were 750,000, which by the standards of the 1700s was gigantic. And then begins our story with Catherine the Great. Because of the title tonight, Czars and Jews, there weren't any Jews until Catherine the Great. And she didn't let him into Russia, she took over Poland. You hear what I said? She didn't let him into Russia, she took over Poland. Then the question was, what do you do with them? Right away, within a short time, it became clear to her, right, that the thing to do is not let him into Russia itself. Keep that policy, but instead keep him confined to the parts of Poland that they took over, and that's what they ended up calling the Pale Settlement. So what you see over here is the part of Poland that she took over. The part of Poland that she took over. That's where our grandparents all came from. You see? She added a tiny bit over here, but later that was taken away. But the overwhelming area, what they call the Pale Settlement, simply means, to use American terms, the Jews can only live in the Northwest. They're not allowed to move to the South. They're not allowed to the Midwest. They're not allowed to the Far West or anything. You have to live in the New England, New York, and that's it. You understand? And this represents a conflictedness that'll be there down till 1917, which is, what do we do with the Jews? What do we do with the Jews? And they're so different. And they're large number as far as minorities go in the Russian Empire. The Jews turned out to be one of the largest minorities. And this is still the 1700s when everybody's from, so it was a baby boom. Okay? As long as it was from, it was a baby boom. Throughout the 1700s and the first half of the 1800s. So the Jewish population in that part of the world, the King of Poland, and parts of taken over Pale Settlement, went through the roof. So it was 750, before long it's 1.5 million, before long it was 3 million, and so forth, right? By the time of the pogroms, it was like 4 million and closer to 5. So if you're Russian, you say like this, the Mexicans are taking over America, like that. That's how they saw it. Now, when Catherine sets this up, so that means that from then on, the Jews, for the next 150 years, or whatever it is, 1772 to 1917, are going to have to get used to living under a different bureaucratic system than had been the case in Poland. They've been for hundreds of years in Poland, and they knew this is the Galicia part, this is the Lithuania part, this is the Ukraine part, all the rest of it. Under Russia, it's ruled by Moscow from top down in what they call the gubernia system. And so our ancestors lived in 6 gubernias, right? So wherever, if you come from Eastern Europe, your people either came from Lithuania part, the Northwest, or the Kovna gubernia, or actually the Vilna gubernia, or the Southwest, the many here who are Ukrainian from the Kiev area, or the Kharkov, which is farther to the east, or the New Russia, the Odessa part again in the east, or the Belarus gubernia, or the Bessarabia gubernia. That's how the Pale Settlement was organized. Okay. So right away you've heard old-timers say, they come from the Kovna gubernia, and they actually mean something, okay? And they're in the States, there they are, okay? And we'll see it better in the map in a second. And these gubernias were divided up into 16 provinces. So there you have them. All right, so if you live in the Vilna gubernia, you could come from the Grodno part, from the Kovna part, from the Vilna part, and so on and so forth. So my father comes from number 5A. My father is from Minsk. He's from Belarus gubernia and from the Minsk province within that. And there you have it. You understand? So I'll just give the story away. The riots and the pogroms 1770 happened around here. Not here. Here. So the question is going to be, what happens? Why? Why did it happen in that specific targeted area? Why wasn't it a general thing all over the place? And that's going to be part of what we're going to try to deal with. But I have to set this up anyway. So when you take your test after this speech tonight, you're going to have to know the 6 gubernias and the 16 provinces within the gubernias. And if you don't, then you get an F. But then again, I'm dealing with an American audience. How many counties are there in the state of Maryland? 3, huh? 23. Let's see. We got a lawyer here. 26 counties? Yeah, you disbarred. They said right? You can't. We're Americans. We don't do geography. That's how it goes, right? Although a lawyer has the best shot at knowing the county seats. I think my brother-in-law probably knows all the county seats because he's had to appear for them. Ari maybe has what's the county seat in Comico County or something like that. But we have that tradition. That's how our state is organized way back from colonial times. So the Russians had their system. They had the 6 and the 16, the 6 gubernias and the 16 provinces within them. Okay. Now, as I said before, the first person who founded all this was Catherine the Great, who ruled 1762 to 1796, if that means anything. So she was the Empress of Russia at the time of the American Revolution, if that helps, right? Time of George Washington. If you really know your history, John Paul Jones, after the Revolutionary War, went to work for her. Okay? Anyway, so she wasn't Russian, she was a German princess, so when she acquires all these 750,000 Jews, she doesn't have the visceral repulsion. She's more thinking in terms of raison d'etat, practical politics, what will help the state. Now, that's very interesting because the Jews maybe could be of utility to the state, certainly in the economic sense. Her attitude was therefore more focused on the economics. And let's face it, when the Russians come and take over those areas of Poland, they're astonished. And the reason is very simple. Russia was run like a piece of garbage. It was starving, the agriculture was bad, the cultural level, the infrastructure was bad, all the rest of it. And the climate was not hospitable. The Russians grew very little food. They came to the Ukraine and to Belarus. And it's like coming to Florida. The Russian travelers are sent by the Czars and by these royal societies in St. Petersburg to explore the new territories. They said, wow, it's like Gan Eden. You understand? And why? It never occurred to them. Maybe they're running the country different than a Russian system, which is very harsh and top-down. Now, the Poles had their feudal system, but it had evolved. And the Polish landlords, and I don't mean landlords like in Baltimore, I mean the Polish magnates who owned the territory, the great noblemen, they ran their economies the way they wanted to, not the way the central government, because there wasn't a central government in Poland. That was the problem with Poland. Russia is the central government situation. The government tells you what to do, and the result is everything very top-down, and the economy was never run very well. So instead of doing what they should have done, which is to say, gee, maybe now we got these new territories, let's import some of their ways into Russia and fix the place up. They said, no, we got to level it down and make them as poor as we are. And they put in a whole bunch of economic policies and others narrowly based on what they perceived as Russian national interest, which is to stick it to the Poles and get rid of the noblemen as the owners of the territory and things like that. And it ended up impoverishing huge numbers. So when Catherine started out, she could not help notice that the Jews were a key element in the economy of Poland. By the time you get the Russians coming in 1772, the Jews kind of controlled the Polish economy under the control of the great nobles. By that I mean the stores are Jewish, the banks such as you had at that time, meaning the money lending institution, were Jewish. The brokerages were Jewish. So if you're a farmer in Poland, first of all, you're a peasant, so you work for you belong to somebody. But who comes at the beginning of the season and then handles and figures what am I going to do with your crop and the minute the crop is harvested, we'll take it away and market it for you, all the rest, and here's the cash. There's always a Jew. Who's the one that's doing all the exports? It's always going to be some kind of Jewish situation. This is the way it was. Now, there are reasons for it, and I talked about it a couple years ago, but that's the way it landed in Poland. The Russians don't like that, okay? The Jews were a key element in Poland because the nature of the Polish economy totally dominated by the nobles. But it was Catherine's policy as a Russian to undermine the nobles. You get it? When they took over Poland, she said, I swear that I won't hurt the nobles at all. But immediately she starts like this. Any chance you can get, buy up the land of a nobleman and put him out of business, if you can. Right? This is how the Russians operate. So if your national policy, as you see it, is to undermine the current people who are managing the economy, then against the Jews too, because they're part of that system. And that's my point. It was Russian state policy to undermine the Jews because they were the ones supporting the Polish Szlachta economy, the noble economy. And that's why this book that came out a couple years ago details this in a very sad way. The shtetl that you think of, which is Fiddler on the Roof, and the poverty, and all the rest of it. Oh, my grandparents went from Russia, and they came to America, Golden Medina, all the rest of it. That's the result of Czars rule. When it was under Poland, the Eastern Europe, the shtetl were bustling. It was a crazy economy because the whole town everywhere was one giant flea market 365 days a year. Because that's what Jews did. That's what it was, not on Shabbos. Right? But all the rest of the days is a flea market. I'm buying and selling constantly. And even out of your house, out of your living room, it was crazy. But on the other hand, what does that mean? For a shopper, it's a paradise. You get what I'm saying? You could get anything anywhere in the old Poland. It may take a week or two. Because that was the kind of capitalistic system that was going on. The noblemen always taking off a piece on the top. But now under Russia, you're not going to have that anymore. Now, from the perspective of the Jews, had they been permitted to penetrate into Russia proper, it would have been a win-win situation. So if what would have happened would have been, which didn't, that once Catherine took over these provinces, she said, okay, now you're part of the country, the Jews are part of Russia, so therefore you can go and trade and do business from here to here, all the way to Kamchatka, why not? So that would have been good for the Jews because it would have provided a large area of economic activity, okay? Now I can open a chain of stores in the middle of Siberia, okay? And they would have done it because you're always desperate to make money somehow. And it would have been good for Russia because they would have developed the country business-wise and in terms of the natural resources. I heard of a country in the 18th and particularly 19th century that did that. It's called the USA. Maybe you've heard of it. They just opened the West, Midwest, and what they say, go do your thing. And millions came from Europe, Germany and Swedes and all that sort of thing. But as we know, it's called Minnesota, it's called Kansas, right? And what they do, they open up farms everywhere, and they open up roads everywhere, and eventually with the railroads, and eventually it's industry, and eventually it's true, they wiped out the buffalo and cut down the forest. I mean, ecological was a problem. No question about that. But on the other hand, they transformed this into the richest country in the world. The highest standard of living. Now Russia has, 10 times what America had? Look at that. And if you know, I mean, in the winter it's not fun, but in the summer, it's unbelievable wealth there. But I think even today, there's something like 8 or 10 million people living in whole Siberia, which means it's underpopulated, which means the economy was never developed, and they didn't want to let the Jews or other people like the Jews in there. You understand? And that's the story of the Czars rule. Now, all this has to do with what's going to emerge as the riots, the pogroms in 1881. That's the reason I'm telling you all this. Catherine the Great was a classic enlightened despot, as they used to call it in the 18th century. She was a mercantilist. Now, mercantilists should have pushed her into a pro-Jewish position. Mercantilism is the economic theory that trade generates wealth. Well, gee whiz, if trade generates wealth, what do you want to encourage? People to open stores, open businesses. Because when you open a store, then you have to hire people to sell, and people will come and be attracted. We have a couple people here that went through Budapest buying the other day, you know what I'm saying? And they're going to have a cab and get an Uber, and they're going to get a coffee. You see what I'm saying? This is the theory of mercantilism. and by the accumulation of profitable balances, which the government should encourage by means of protectionism. That's a bunch of fancy words which say like this: you run a country like you run, hopefully, your household economy, which is you want to have a favorable balance, and you have more coming in than going out. It's called saving, right? When you can, you consider running in the red a bad thing, okay? It happens, but it's not great. And in a perfect world, you'd spend nothing and take in everything. That's what you always do. So mercantilism means you run a country on that basis. It's not Adam Smith, it's before Adam Smith. But that way, everybody's a ruler, a king, a czar, or anything like that. You want to grab and chop around as much wealth as you can, and you want to pay out as little as you can. So wait a minute. Why should I spend money importing some junk from Germany? I can get a Jew, move him to Russia, he'll build a factory and make it over here. I won't have to spend the money out there. That's a mercantilist way of thinking. You see? So mercantilism could have been good for the Jews as far as Russia is concerned. That's how the Jews got accepted in much of Western Europe in the 18th century as a result of mercantilist policies. China, let's go to the next one. China's mercantilist. To the degree they're able to, they stick it to everybody. They do mamish what I said. Spend as little as possible, sell as much as possible. Right? They're up against the fact that it's no longer a mercantilist world. Because if I do that, if I spend as little as possible and make you buy as little as possible, you end up broke. And if you end up broke, then what? Can't buy from me anymore. Right? But China's been doing that ever since the 1970s, which is why Trump's fighting them. Because they don't say, let's work out something that's good for both sides. We can make money, you can make money, free trade, you understand? We'll sell you this, you'll sell us this, and everybody will do well. And by the way, then you'll have money to pay me for other things also. They don't see it that way. It's a zero-sum game. They want to get a hold of all the resources and all the rest of it. So this was the mentality of Catherine the Great. Even though it's funny that she lived at the time of Adam Smith, when he was, of course, replacing mercantilism with free trade capitalism. So, if Russia would have gone that route, that would have worked good for the Jews also. If they would have said, we take off all the tariffs and all the rest of it and just trade with the ganze Welt, the Jews could have found a way there also. Notice, if you have some normal, at least logical economic system, if I'm a smart Jew, just tell me the rules, and I'll work within the rules, and then get out of my way. And there's nothing wrong with that, you'd think. But Catherine was successfully lobbied by the merchants of Russia, who were not in the League of the Jews. The merchants of Russia proper, who argued that if you let in the Jews, you'll end up with Amazon killing all the retail stores. You see? If you let in the Jews, they'll undercut everybody, they'll put everybody out of business, they're just better than us, they're better networks, they'll sell cheaper, all we Russians will go broke, and the Amazon will own the whole country, and Amazon is Jewish, and this is not a Jewish country. This is not a Jewish country. That's what they said, okay? And Catherine gave in to the Russian merchants for cultural reasons, maybe religious reasons, and she forbade the Jews from entering Russia proper, and that's where you get the Pale Settlement. Right? Because they're afraid. If you let the Jews mamish into Moscow, you let the Jews in St. Petersburg, and places like that, pretty soon, all these little makolas will be wiped out by Jewish department stores and giants and all that kind of business, because that's who the Jews are. And it's a matter of business efficiency. They don't want to hear about that. You understand? So this economic counterintuitive policy had results down till today. It condemned Russia to poverty down until the present day. So there's a straight line from Catherine to Lenin to Putin, in which Russia is a gigantic country, theoretically should be the richest country in the world because they have better resources than anybody. The Russians are not stupid people at all, okay? But because of these historical funny reasons, they didn't want to take they want to bite the bullet and take correct economic decisions if it would be culturally distasteful to them, let's put it that way. No, they didn't want to the Jews. So in other words, the Russians privilege culture over economics, and that happens. That's a Papikennan word, right? If you privilege culture over economics, he'll say, don't have so much capitalism, but don't let in, foreigners to do the work and that sort of thing. do protectionism, protect the white American workers in the factories. There's a Trump bill doing that, you know. It's, you're talking culture over economics. True, you can buy it a little bit cheaper if it's made in China, but what about the American worker? Why don't you pay an extra 2 cents, 5 cents, and give an American a chance to support his family? It's that kind of thing, right? And, you know, both have appeals, agreed? Both have appeals. In a ruthless economic, you know, setting, anything you can sell for a penny less, you do it. But these are issues with which you and I deal today, and there is a logic to it. I always like to point out that Europe today is in the process of going Muslim because economics is taking precedence over culture. Because economics is taking precedence over culture. It's unbelievable. Countries like France and Belgium and all the rest of it, they land a zillion people because they said economically, we have an aging population, you know, nobody's having children. Who's going to pay for the welfare benefits? Somebody has to produce the wealth by working in the stores and in the factories. We don't have the people to do it, so therefore let's bring in foreigners, even if they settle down here and take over the country. But like Madame Pompadour said, après-moi le déluge, as long as it doesn't happen in my lifetime. And therefore you have the craziest things happening. So when you privilege economics over culture, be prepared for that, right? The people who want unlimited immigration in the United States are privileging economics over culture. Right? Because they say, I don't care if you bring in a zillion foreigners, and they'll change the language, change the country, and change everything else, but it'll be good for the economy. This is the argument today for those who want unlimited and illegal, as they call it, immigration, because it's good economically. So Russia didn't go this way. But on the other hand, you have to have some logic to your economy. So in typical Russian fashion, a small number of exceptions were allowed for prominent Jewish merchants. So already in the time of Catherine the Great, you have some Jews living in St. Petersburg. Not many. You have some Jews living in Moscow. Not many. But these are the guys who are big contractors and all that sort of thing. Okay? No, Jewish millionaires. I mean, you need some economic sense. If you're Russian and you're Prince Potemkin, somebody's got to supply the army, you know. Can't rely on the Goyim. That's what it is. You know. Well, he had a famous rabbi as his army contractor, Zeitlin. Shua Zeitlin. Talmud Chacham too. Who organized all the military and his colonization projects in the newly conquered territories in the Crimea and all this. Quite a story, but I don't have time to go into it. Now, since in the 18th century, the rich were still frum, right? It's the 1700s. So you talk about rich merchants, they're still frum. So one of the clever moves of the Lubavitch, the Balatanya, from the very beginning, was to organize a group of his rich followers to reside in St. Petersburg and kiss up to the high Russian officials because you're going to know how to deal with them. This is part of Lubavitch lore, Chabad lore, that already when the Russians took over, and he started operating in the 1780s, so right in the middle of the Catherine era, he says, I see who we're dealing with. It's not Poland anymore, it's Russia. Everything's centralized, top down. When the Jews lived in Poland, you didn't have to know the king that well. You just had to know your local lord. Okay? But in Russia, you got to know the government, and it's a bureaucratic government, so you got to know the bureaucrats, all the rest of it, which means you have to bribe them. And that's how they do business in Eastern Europe. I know you're shocked to hear that in Baltimore, Maryland, but that's how I'm told as they do in Eastern Europe. And from day one, he got a whole bunch of that's the people who got him out of jail 2 times. You know, so when he was in prison by the Tsar, and similar situations. This is how it works. And you know, he knows from the Gemara. They told Rabbi Yochanan that the Persians have come into Babylonia and they passed out. They said, but they take bribery, so they woke up. Right? Because how have Jews survived? How is a helpless minority with no power whatsoever, relying on the tender mercies of merciless people? How are you supposed to survive that way? How are you supposed to do it? You see? People can smirk and schmirk and clerk. How do you do it? You see? These are the tools that help us. Now, the trouble is, as we shall see, the grandchildren of these rich, from Jews will all assimilate and Russify to one degree or another. Because, as I was saying when we were in Europe the other day, there's like a 4-generation rule. I don't know any rich family that after 4 generations is all Jewish, which is quite a statement, or 5 generations at the most. I'll say it again. I don't know any family that got rich, and their great-grandchildren, whatever it is, are still Jewish, right? Which is quite a statement. So anyway, when that happens, they're going to identify with the Russians, and we'll see the rich don't behave very well in the wake of the 1881 pogroms, the rich Jews. Anyway, these broad policies that I just described in the last few minutes that evolved under Catherine the Great remained in force for the rest of Russian history until the First World War, for the next 130 years. That's the reason I've gone into this, because from Catherine to Nicholas, it's the fundamentally same policies. Even in 1914, a Jew's not allowed to move out of the Pale Settlement, right? Unless you're rich, in a special case. So that's a crazy country we just described. Most of the Jews of the world live there, the largest Jewish population. So it's not just a piquant little interesting case. The Jews of the Grand Duchy of Liechtenstein. We're talking about the majority population over here, a Jewish population, or the largest Jewish population. And the result of everything I just described is the impoverishment of the masses. So under the Czars, the Jews in the Pale Settlement will be pretty doggone poor, with a few exceptions, of course. But the economic profile in Eastern Europe is one of poor, or, what's the right word? Just able to make it. As we say in America, paycheck to paycheck, just able to make it. Which is pretty bad, okay? Which is pretty bad. Now, of course, the clever can always make money. The way you made money in the Pale Settlement in the Russian Empire was either through the residual Polish nobility, who still stayed for a long time. So you see here the Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, that's Chaim Volozhiner, who was a rich Jew, a millionaire, because he was business partner with a Polish nobleman who owned the area. This is early on, he died in 1820, so this is early on in the process. There still were these big Polish guys, and you could cut a deal with them. That was the old system, been for hundreds of years. As the Russians Russify more and more, it's going to be hard to do that. So that's one way of making money. Another way of making money is to supply the Russian government, like the army and the railroads. So this is the guy who built all the railroads, Polakov. Meaning he raised the money and then put it together. He was the guy who built the big railroads. Yeah, Jewish guy. In the middle of the 1800s. And here's Gunsberg, the guy who supplied the military. Okay, so these guys live in St. Petersburg. Okay, and the first generation is by the grandchildren. They're out. They're gone. This is how it works. And just because they're rich doesn't help the little guy. Right? Doesn't help the little guy. This is the way it went. So now, to move on, by the time Catherine the Great died, which was in 1796, Russia was involved in 2 decades of costly wars with the French. Okay? That's a long time. That's expensive. 20 years of wars with the French. This is before Napoleon and then Napoleon. So at the beginning, it was these two guys, the Tsar Paul and this guy who was the greatest general in Russian history, Suvorov. There's even a movie about him. Let's go to the next one. Just the picture, not the sound. No time, right? And here's he beat the French because he never went up mano a mano with Napoleon, but he could have beaten them. Suvorov was a military genius. Okay, and so in that period, this scene is taking place in the Swiss Alps. What the heck is the Russian army doing in the Swiss Alps? He crossed the Swiss Alps to surprise the French in the rear. I'm just trying to tell you, people don't know. He had a whole string of military victories in northern Italy, in Milan. So the Russians were amazing once upon a time, and therefore, whatever's happening afterwards is not, they say, choosing the shortest route, which the enemy didn't expect. They go right over the Alps, like Hannibal. Okay, and they lost a lot of men on the way. It's a famous Russian movie. Right? I don't have time to show you the whole thing. So, anyway, my point is that they spent a whole bunch of years fighting before Napoleon, and then let's go to the next one. Then came Napoleon, in which it was Napoleon versus Paul's son, Alexander I. He had a whole bunch of battles. You've heard of Austerlitz, for example, right? A whole bunch of battles in which Napoleon beat him. But it was always in somebody else's territory. Does anybody know where Austerlitz is? It's right where we were the other day, right near Mikolov. Right? It's in Moravia, okay? Central Europe. So if the Russian army is fighting the French in Central Europe, that's pretty good. They're far away from Russia. But eventually, I think everybody knows, because you had Quaker Oats, that Napoleon invaded Russia, right? And, Tchaikovsky. And he penetrated all the way to Moscow, which means, look what he did. He marched right from here, right to Moscow, right through the Jewish territory, right to Belarus, okay? So when Napoleon had his invasion of Russia, he was smarter than Hitler, sort of. Well, he didn't have trucks, but Hitler made the mistake of not going straight from Moscow. Napoleon made it from Moscow. Now, he didn't have a plan to do once he got to Moscow, that's true, and then that's why he got messed up, but he got there, okay? He went to the shortest route. Now, this takes him right through the Jewish territory. It was a tremendous crisis for Russia, and everybody's read War and Peace, right? Or at least they saw a movie. And so, it was a catastrophe for Russia. It was an invasion. In other words, they went through Poland, through Belarus, into Russia proper, and all the way into Moscow. So at that point, Russia had a crisis. What did the Jews do? What did the Jews do? Meaning the Jews along the way. Now, the Jews are not in Russia proper, but they're in Belarus as part of the Pale settlement. So, and they're in Lithuania as part of the Pale settlement. Napoleon was in Vilna. Okay? He was in Vilna. So what do? Here you have the famous story, the Hasidic tale. And whenever a Hasidic tale, it's not exactly true, but of the famous debate between the two Hasidic rabbis that I'm sure everybody's heard of. One was the Baal Tanya, the Lubavitch, and the other one was before there was a town called Lubavitch, but Chabad, and the Chozeh of Lublin, and one said, let's support the French, the other one said, let's support Russia, right? Raise your hands if you know what I'm talking about. I see a few people. And the Chozeh of Lublin said, we should support the French because they'll bring civil rights for the Jews, because the French Revolution has emancipated the Jews. And the Baal Tanya said, no. If they do that, they'll become modern, they won't come from. Better, they should suffer under the Tsar and stay from. In effect, that's the conversation. Now, that's a Hasidic story. But what's the truth behind the story? And as best as I can tell, and that's all you ever get over here, best as I can tell, is the Baal Tanya was a smart guy, and he said like this. One thing you can tell about the Russians, if we side with their enemies and they win, they will kill us all or send us all to Siberia. That's what they do. You understand? Stalin did this in World War II to the Tatars and the Chechens and the others. You get it? As soon as nobody was looking right after Stalingrad, he picked the whole population, deported them to Siberia and in the middle of the snow and, have lunch on your own, as they say. Eat a polar bear. But he was scared the Jews would do it. And so the Baal Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, said they have to support the Russians. And he set up a spy system pro-Russia. And there are all kinds of stories about this. And he died in 1812, fleeing the French army. That's the story of Alter Rebbe. Talk to Annie Lubavitcher. And he was right, because as you know, Russia eventually won. Napoleon collapsed in Russia. The army fell apart because of the snow, as everybody knows. The Russians came back. They couldn't say nothing about the Jews. Jews have been 100% loyal. Even Tsar Alexander issued a declaration. He says, you can't say nothing against the Jews. Right? Even his brother, who later became the Mamzer of all Mamzerim, Nicholas I, who was a Grand Duke, traveling in 1816 through the provinces. He says, I hate the Jews are this, the Jews are that. It's very surprising they were 100% loyal in the recent war. So, that policy of being loyal to Russia at least saved them from a fate worse than death. But it didn't result in what you would hope it would result, which is the Russians should feel good about them, right? That the regime, because they're not that type, they're bad people. The Tsarist regime were bad people. They don't have the milk of human kindness, not for non-Russians. But at least we didn't give them an excuse. You understand? So this is the crazy system, that they had to live with over there, because even though the Tsar, after Napoleon was defeated after 1815, had no basis to kick the Russians out, or kick the Jews out for treason, but the very nature of what we call the bureaucratic absolutist state cannot help but be repulsed by a large Jewish population in its western provinces, which is so different in every way and so un-Russian, and they see so un-Russifiable. You can't turn them into Russians. Because you look at a Chassid, you look at an Eastern European Jew, even a Litvish at that time, they can't be turned into Russians, but we got to do it. So let me explain. For the next 100 years, actually from Catherine on, for the next 100 years, the Jews will be controlled not by a democratic government, but by a dictatorship called the Czars of Russia. But what's pshat a dictator? A dictator says, I rule the whole country. Yeah, but how do you actually do that in real life? Was a guy sit down and spend all day long finding out what 60 million people do? There's no time for that. And so what you have to do is you have to set up people under you called bureaucrats. And they do the actual running of it, although you can intervene anytime you want because you're the top dog. And this is called the czarist system. So they had the czar with ministers and governors and all that kind of stuff down to the local dog catcher level, all of which is appointed at the top or somewhere along the way. And it's all designed to facilitate that the guy in the top can do whatever the heck he or she wishes to do. That's the whole point. It's called autocracy. Get it? So in real world, if I'm Jewish and I live in a place like Baltimore, if it was in Tsarist Russia, Baltimore would be under a governor general appointed by some guy over there. I have no choice in who that person is. Right? I have no choice in who that person is. And that person applies the rules from the top down. And if he does anything against the Jewish community, the only thing the Jewish community can do is try to figure some way to bribe them to pretend it's happening when it doesn't really happen. And that's the way Russia was run. And you can read the Inspector General by Gogol and a whole bunch of other Russian writings in which they either make fun of it or bemoan it or all the rest of it. But that's the way it goes. You understand? You can't appeal to the mercy of the Tsar, although they try to from time to time. It doesn't have any mercy. You can't appeal to this guy, that guy. You can only appeal this way. And, get used to it. If you want to live, that's how you're going to live. Okay? Now, compared to what I just described, the situation in the good old days of the Kingdom of Poland was a paradise. You understand? Believe me, the Jews look back and say, oh, my grandfather's time, my Bubby's time, all the rest of it. We didn't have all this junk. The borders were different. The economy was different. Like I said, we had a continual flea market. Everything was great, and so on and so forth. But that's not the way it is now. And most importantly, cultural insularity, which is the hallmark of the religious Jew, the Ashkenazic Jew, the Polish Jew, was now going to be under direct attack because the Jews now are going to be for 100 years under a government that's kind of like at war with them. Now, not in the Hitler way, but at war with their culture. The goal of the bureaucrats is to turn these people into Russians. They're not black, they're white. If they're black, they stand out. If they're yellow, they stand out. They're white. So they can amalgamate. I'm telling you how they think, okay? The bureaucratic mindset. So you can make them one of us, or the children or the grandchildren. It can happen. Now, in order to do that, we got to get rid of all these bad habits and external dress and ways of thinking, and we got to get them thinking like Russians, and give it another generation or two, and we will Russianize them. So it's sort of like the Muslims did when they the spread of the Islamic religion in that way, in which we get you, and at least your children will become Muslim, and all the rest of it. So forget the good old days of the Kingdom of Poland and the happy hunting ground for cultural insularity. The goal, ultimately, there of the czarist officials, the bureaucratic absolutist officials, is bureaucratic absolutist. You're under bureaucrat and they have absolute power. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't appeal or recall them or vote them out or anything like that. The goal is simply to convert the Jews, even though they know that doesn't happen overnight. Because if I convert you, you're not a problem anymore. You're part of the Russians. Adarabba, you add your Jewish sneakiness to the Russian gene pool, it helps everybody out. That'll be the ultimate achievement, to assimilate them and amalgamate them into the Russian people, but they recognize it's a long-term project. So here you are, your Bubby's Bubby, way back when, somewhere in Eastern Europe, having no idea probably of what the officials are saying. Well, no, they have a pretty good idea. You don't have to be a genius to figure out what I just said. Okay? You don't have to listen into the secret conversations in St. Petersburg in the ministry to know what you're dealing with. But if that's the long-term goal, what's the short-term goal? The short-term goal is to make the Jews incrementally less distinct and less separate from the Gentiles. Okay? The Jews, by the time the Russians took over, Catherine and all that, were really a state within a state. Now, not politically, but culturally, right? like Fiddler on the Roof. There's the Jewish part of town, that's the other part of town, right? Here they do Pesach, there they do Easter. Here they do Hanukkah and all that, there they do Christmas. And, we know about them and we see them and they see us, but that's it. They're living like a divorce. You get it? And that's how it was officially, certainly in Poland. And yes, they dealt with each other in terms of business and in the marketplace and in the 7-Elevens, the hotels and all that kind of stuff the Jews used to run. But broadly, culturally speaking, the Jew lives in his own little world. And the Poles expected it and the Jews expected it, and everybody was happy. I'll tell you a story. Last week, 2 Saturdays ago from today, we were in Vienna. And we went to the shul Friday night. Or maybe it was Shabbos afternoon. And next door to the shul, the Stadt Temple, is a restaurant, Aleph, adjacent to it. And that street has all kind of bars and discos and this and that and the other. It's a nightlife type place. Nothing wrong. They're not bothering anybody. Beer halls and all that sort of business. So it's full of people, not Jewish, carrying on, dressed in every way you can imagine, all the rest of it. And there is 3-4 little Hasidic kids of the owner running around, playing in the street, where everybody is totally oblivious to the world around them. You understand? With payas, all the rest of it. And they couldn't have been more incongruous visually. I mean, it would be good for a movie maker, Visually, they're playing hide and go seek with each other. Did you notice that? And cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, they didn't see nothing. That's the Polish Jews of yesteryear, as their ancestors. Yeah, they live in Poland, this and that and the other. They do their thing. The Jew does his thing, and and as they gate us. The Russian officials don't like that. They hate that because that means you're a large non-Russian group in Russian territory. At least it's Russian territory now, and you're potentially like that. Maybe you're a danger one day. No, we proved that we were loyal during the Napoleon invasion. Well, we just don't like a different group. Okay, and we want you to. They always use this language in the documents to be less separate from the others. So how do you do that? The goal that emerges from the discussions among the officials and the high machers is to encourage anything that promotes westernization among the Jews. For this will weaken the frum culture that acts as a mighty bastion of cultural insularity. And there's truth to that. So if you leave the Jews alone the way the Poles left the Jews alone, then the Jews will have a hard shell of cultural insularity. But if you prick it and wear it away, it will disappear, and the Jews will just join everybody else. And by the way, this is what I just told you from the best of the officials, the ones that were least violent. The other officials, the mass of officials, regard the Jews with a remarkable cognitive dissonance. I always find this very interesting. On the one hand, they look at them as uncivilized, what's the right word, low elements. The way a racist used to look at black people in the South or Mexicans or something like that. They're Jews. But on the other hand, they say these guys are brilliantly clever in business, and if you leave them alone for a minute, they'll own the whole town. So wait a minute, which is it? Right? Which is it? Do you have contempt for them because they're obviously discussing a low level, or do you have fear for them because they're actually very clever and smarter than you? And they have both. How can you have both? It's cognitive dissonance. You can have it. It's very classic Eastern European attitude toward the Jews. It's like, but if you leave that Hasidic guy with the funny thing on there, he'll own, Amazon. You get it? He'll buy up all the real estate. It's funny, because in Western racism, you assign the group you don't like, it's like a low economic existence, and that sort of thing. It's a condescension. Here, you're culturally condescending, but economically, it's the opposite. Like they're better than we are. It's weird. This is the Jews are living are undue. The officials in the first half of the 1800s under Nicholas I, we'll see, were rarely educated. He usually took army officers for high positions in the army, in the government. The minister, they're all army officers and generals and admirals. Generals and admirals don't have education. They have military education. You know what I'm saying? They don't have a liberal education. Not in those days. You rose up through the ranks. As a person without a college degree, but a military background. Really, the person should be in charge of education, the minister of culture, you see what I'm saying? Doesn't go. But the czars like guys who are yes sir types. And they like that bureaucratic kind of system in there. Lately, you see a lot of presidents surround themselves with these types. Right? The last couple of presidents appointed generals, ex-generals to these positions because they like that, yes sir business. So as a result, the policy involved was to try to wean the Jews away from the current orthodoxy, but not in such a way to result in the Jews becoming atheists. See, this is always the problem. You want to unfrom them, but then you want to Christianize them. But when you unfrom, there's a big danger that the person loses religion, they lose religion. After all, is Christianity more logical than Judaism? Give me a break. Right? It's not more logical. So, especially Russian Orthodoxy is a profoundly mystical kind of business. So you undo the Jewish religion, but then somehow or other move them into the Christian column, the danger always being that you unfrom somebody and then they simply become westernized, materialistic, and atheistic, which of course happened. The Tsar and his family were eventually shot by a firing squad run by a Jewish guy named Yurovsky in 1918, who came from, his parents were from, and he went through this process. They became totally divorced from religion, and then ended up as a communist. You see? So, but that's the plans of the Russian officials. So by the time you get to the next Tsar, which is Nicholas I, these notions had crystallized into a set of harsh government policies pressuring the Jews to change various institutions of cultural insularity. And here's the mamzer who did it. That's a polite term. The Emperor Nicholas I, he was. The Emperor Nicholas I, Tsar Nikolai, who was really a very cruel type person, particularly toward the Jews. He was cruel to everybody, but the Jews took on the chin. And I know you're smirking all the rest of it, but give me 2 minutes and you'll be agreeing with me. Now the only thing, he had a very military kind of mind, and the pressure on the Jews to change various institutions of cultural insularity assumed the form of a carrot and stick. Because that's the only kind of language these guys know, carrot and stick. The carrot would be to encourage maskilin. This is Isaac Ber Levinson, the leading maskil in the beginning of the 1800s in Russia. So the Tsar is always writing to him and encouraging him to spread enlightenment among your fellow Jews and teach them because he wants to weaken the orthodoxy. You get it? And what is this guy, as a maskil, what do they say? We did this a couple years ago. The maskil were looking to expand Jewish openness, to erode insularity. They view cultural insularity as a bad thing, right? They want to expand the definition of Jewish besides Gemara. They want to open Jews to the current culture around them. What's wrong with learning English or learning Russian? These are things that the Russian officials want to encourage. So he gave him a gold medal, Nikolai I, okay? So that's one thing. Also a carrot would be agreeing eventually to set up maskilic school systems. So they set up a whole system of bet-to-fill schools to knock out the TIs, using Pogroms language. And therefore you need teachers in the bet-to-fill schools, so therefore that's 12 jobs right off the top. And that you get to the maskil to give them a government salary. Encouraging Jews to go to university. All the universities are totally open to all the Jews in the time of Nicholas I. Because most of the time you enter the university, by the time you're finished, you're not Jewish anymore. Because you're exposed to a it's not even American university, which is pretty bad. Russian university, the cultural waves that run across you are huge. It's a very famous story, I'm sure I've told it before. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who lived at this time, and he had a student who he encouraged himself to go to medical school, become a doctor, and then stay frum and then show a good model. Like we say today, YU, show a good model. You can be MD and be a Shomer Shabbos, all the rest of it. And it was one of his best students, and the guy converted. And he never got over it. That's one of the reasons for his depression later in life. This is the atmosphere. But these are the carrots. Now what about the sticks? Because Nicholas I was first and foremost a cold-hearted mamzer, so his main tool was not a carrot but the stick, which he wielded with cruelty against the institutions of cultural insularity one after another. So, for example, they used to have the Kehillah. he eliminates the Kehillah as having autonomy. Right away in 1826, the Jewish community no longer has the power that they used to have over there to compel members to follow Judaism. Number two, which is a huge blow in Eastern Europe. Number two, he goes to war against Jewish clothing, and he made it work. You know what I'm talking about? They stop lady in the street and pull off the shaitel, the police, and expose her to big humiliation. If a guy's wearing a payas after a certain point, the police would come and cut it off and take the ear with it necessarily, No, I'm serious. And if you wear a strimal and this, that, and the other, the cops will come and whack you over the head. And by physical force, they made it that the old Jewish dress, which was like Satmar, the Litvaks all used to dress like Satmar, right, was transformed because either they had the Russian dress or German dress. And that was the decree. And the Jews went basically for Russian dress, which is a certain style. And that's why, somebody like the Chavetz Chaim is wearing a little Russian hat, right? Things like that. Because if you didn't, you can get in trouble. So using police force, literally the police, to change the clothing, is very typical of Nicholas I and the Czar system. You don't find it anywhere else in Europe. But you sure as heck find it in Russia. Some Jews tried to pay money to get exempted from it. By the time it's over, all the Jews have to decide one way or the other. When they did it later on in Poland, there was a big reaction against it, but that was after Nicholas I's time. In Russia proper, meaning Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, such places, you had to conform. You had to conform. Now, maybe for a Rebbe, they might make an exception. That was considered a big exception for a Rebbe. That's it. You see, all the for the chief, all the Indians have to dress like Russians, or like Germans, Western style. And this is a principal attack on institutions. Clothes is an institution of cultural insularity. Right? Clothes institution. When you see somebody walk around today with a black hat and a white this and that, they're making a statement of cultural insularity. That's what they're doing. Torah literature. They declared war on Sfarim. They made it very hard to publish a book. They put a very heavy censorship on it. You can only publish a book in one or two places, and only after it went through a very thorough censorship of former Jews who are looking to excise and cut anything that could possibly be construed as either against Russia or not in conformance with what the regime wants. It got to be very tough. They went after the rabbinate. They said the Rabbonim are leaders of cultural insularity, which is true. And so they have to be replaced. How do you replace them? Nicholas I sets up two Russian rabbinical seminaries run by Goyim, one in Vilna and one in Zhytomyr, by Christian generals, right? And they're famous, and for starting in the 1840s. And they're supposed to graduate the rabbis, and they will have the positions in the communities. Now, the Jewish community did a passive resistance. You get what I'm saying? Because that's all you could do. And the result was a screwball reality, spoken about before, that, number one, the good guys didn't go to these places. They kept them out, so only the bad guys. So the type of people that end up in the rabbinical seminary in Vilna Zhytomyr are your losers, reprobates, lowlifes, gamblers, and similar types. I mean it. That's number one. And number two, when they did graduate, no community would hire them. And if the government made you hire them, then you simply had a two-tier system. And you ended up with the rabbi and the official rabbi. It's called the Rav Mitam, or the crown rabbi, the Kazanya Ravina, the crown rabbi. So if you ask me, who was the rabbi of Kovno in the middle of the 19th century, you say Yitzchak Khan Inspector. No, he wasn't. He was in charge. He was working in the kashrus department, salting the meat. That's how it was official in the books. The real rabbi was a pharmacist who graduated from the rabbinical seminary in Vilna, and when the government told him this guy should be the rabbi. And he's the one, if you want to get married, or divorced, or born, they have metric books. It's only official if he puts it in. You get it? So you couldn't hit him, you couldn't make fun of him, you're stuck with him. And so you have a two-tiered system. If you have a shaila, you go to Yitzchak Khan Inspector. If you have to deal with, property matters, all the rest, you got to go to this guy. And Nicholas I thought, if he does this system, he'll replace the first group of rabbis with a second group of rabbis. That didn't work out that way, but that's something we'll deal with next time. I'm just trying to show you how he went after each one of the institutions. And of course, he went after the elimination of the chaters, because he said the cheder is mamish, the hearth of the cultural insularity, which is true. Okay? The old Yiddishkeit starts with the chaters, with all of their problems. Okay? And so you want to replace them, like I say, with a whole system of betaphilas, and worse. And the funny part is, they didn't even actually understand what Judaism is. They just, it's like the pornography. I know when I see it and I don't like it. Okay? And indeed, they even said, who is it? Let's go to the next one. This is Prince Levin, who is the Minister of Education, and he writes to the leading Moscow. And he said, what exactly is the Talmud anyway? I mean, I know it's bad, but what is it? Right? I see the Jews are all into studying the Talmud, like, what, and obviously that promotes the cultural insularity. What exactly is the Talmud? And indeed, the government even sends him an official questionnaire. Look at this. What is the Talmud? Who's the author? When and where and what language was it written? Have the Jews such books, other books of such authority? Is there anything sensible in the Talmud? Oh no, Right? It's stated that it's full of improbable legends and fables. Is that true? They don't know anything. I told you, these guys never went to college. They're army officers. They're told by the emperor to implement policies, and they don't even know what they're implementing. Okay? How could the officers of the Talmud permit themselves to add and subtract from the commandments of the Torah, which forbids that? All of a sudden, they became so frum. Baal Tosef, Baal Tigra, What is the object of the numerous rituals that consume so much useful time? Like, what did you... Now, I love this. Do you know anything at all about Russian Orthodoxy? Their prayers take longer than ours. Okay? I'm just saying, why do you have such crazy rituals that take up so much time? Yeah, that's rich. Anyway, is it true that Jews are descendants of the Pharisees, whom the law were given to Christians under Jesus accused of lying and superstition? Is it true that the Talmud forbids the Jews study of foreign languages and science and pursuit of agricultural occupation? What is Hasidim? We hear the word Hasidim, Here's a general in charge of the government, the Department of Education. I hear something, what is Hasidim? Is it a dog? Is it a cat? What is Hasidim? Who is the founder? In what towns do they reside? Do the Jews possess schools or learned books? Wait a minute. How do the Jewish masses regard their schools? Can the condition of the Jews be improved, and how? What Messiah are they expecting? This is great. Is it true the Jews expect to rule the world when the Messiah comes, and the Russians will be excluded from participation in the afterlife? Yeah, the answer is yes. How can a Jew be admitted into Christian society and accorded full civic rights when he keeps himself aloof from the Christians and takes no interest in the welfare of the country in which he resides? So they're just trying to understand literally the ABCs of Judaism, but that doesn't stop them from legislating, okay? That doesn't do anything. Then there's the elimination. The government tries to eliminate all the yeshivas. So the Volozhin yeshiva was closed down officially. They just paid off the local inspector to say it was closed down and turned the other eye. Right? So it's despotism tempered by bribery. And then what's even worse was the introduction of conscription. This turned out to be really bad. Now, well, it's not what you imagine. Russia until the 1870s didn't have a what's the right word? A mass army with draft. They had a professional army, a full-time army, but they used to take peasants to fill the ranks. And it was 0.4% of population, 4 out of 1,000 in every district, 4 out of 1,000. And so, now listen closely. Throughout the history, Jews were never drafted in any armies because since they're not citizens in a special situation, and they have all kind of extra crazy laws and taxes, they're not fit to be in the army or something like that, and Jews wanted it that way. One of the big shocks for the Jews in Western Europe when they got civil rights was now they get drafted. And it was a big controversy, and the Maskilim wanted it, the masses didn't want it, but it happened. However, listen closely, at least in the West, there is a quid and a pro quo. What you're saying is like this: the reason we're drafting you is now we've given you full citizenship, so it means all the, right, not only the benefits, all the obligations. They go with full citizenship. No more ghetto, no more discrimination. In return, if everybody else gets drafted, you get drafted. You hear it, okay? Stop. Now Russia. still ghetto, no rights, if anything worse, and you get drafted. You see what I'm saying? This is Czars Russia. That's why I say it's a mamzer shein kamo. This is, you end up with nothing, and then to make it worse. Now hold on for a second. This is the Russian army, not the American army. Raise your hand if you'd like to spend a week in boot camp. Now raise 2 hands if you'd like to spend a week in Russian boot camp. Okay? Raise 3 hands if you'd like to spend a week in Tsarist Nicholas I Russian boot camp. You understand? You hear where I'm going? Now, what is the reason for the conscription of people who have no rights? It's to convert them. I want you to understand that, right? It's to convert them. You see? Now, it's converted by physical force. It's the 19th century, so you can't do the old way long ago, like Ivan the Terrible. So you use bureaucratic methods. We'll just introduce the army. Nowhere officially is say you have to become a Christian. If you don't become a Christian, I'll punch you. I whack you. The guys will beat you up. They'll sodomize you. They'll do whatever you want. No. You're in a Russian barracks. So if you don't do what they want, you have a novel on your hands. And you're telling me he's not the moms of all times? In other countries, as I said before, conscription followed emancipation, but not here. And conscription in Russia takes on a horrible character because they said every community has to pick out the 4 out of 1,000. And what really happened, therefore, was they pick out the helpless ones, usually little kids, because they're not parents, or their parents are not rich, or they don't really count, and they handed them to a fate worse than death. And what they call the cantonist system. This is a separate law. In addition to the conscription, he also passed a law that the cantonist system will now be applied to Jewish children. Now, what is the cantonist system? Cantons, military cantons. Here you have the East in all its savagery. The Russian Empire and the Turkish Empire had a lot of commonalities. And one of them is what they call the Janissaries, in which you take captive peoples, and you make them give their children over at a young age, and you brainwash them to work in your army against their own people. The Ottomans did it for centuries. The Russians, under Peter the Great, started a cantonist system for children of soldiers because if it's a standing army, you used to serve about 20, 25 years in the Russian army. It's not a 2-year thing like America. It's a 25-year business. So what do you do with their kids? Well, the army will supervise them and raise the kids in such a way to teach them skills that the army can use. So it's a very harsh system. Now it's applied to Jews by Nicholas I. So what does this mean? Their parents are not in the army. They're just little kids taken from the street. Little kids, I say again. And what's going to happen over here? You have a disgusting system, a system of what I would call religious rape and identity rape, right? In which you're using that physical force to get them to change religion on little kids and to change their identity so that they no longer feel Jewish but they feel Russian. And you're doing it through extreme violence, so don't talk to me about Sigmund Freud all the rest. I don't care a thing about that. There is a very famous description that's always quoted in every description of the Cantonists by a guy, by Alexander Herzen, who was one of the most famous Russian dissidents of the 19th century. He was a member of the middle class who later on fled Russia. And this is in time of Nicholas I, and he's passing on a road, and he sees a whole bunch of kids, like a concentration kids, marching along, being marched to some military destination. So in other words, you're a little kid, and from the time you're a little kid, you're subjected to beating up and this and that and the other. You're in a concentration camp. And look what he says over there. He meets this soldier, a lieutenant. He says, who are you carried to this place? Well, you see, they got together a bunch of these accursed Jewish youngsters. This is the sergeant talking. Between 8 and 9. I suppose they were meant for the fleet, but how should I know? At first, our command was to drive them to Perm, which is a place. But now we just got to change in orders. We're told to drive them to Kazan. Drive them. Okay? I had them on my hands for 100 miles or so. The officer then turned them over to me, said they were an awful nuisance. A third of them remained on the road, meaning they died on the way. Little kid, marching in Russia. Half of them won't get to their destination. Epidemics I saw, says Herzen, like a dummy, going. No, not epidemics. They just fall like flies. Well, these Jewish kids are so puny and delicate, they can't stand mixing dirt for 10 hours with dry biscuits to live on. No, they're not used to that. I'll say it again, an 8-year-old kid. Now, wait a second. Well, then, you hear a cough. And again, strange folks, no father, no mother, no caresses. So, was I exaggerating when I say he's the moms of all times? Well, then, you just have a cough, and the kid's dead. Hello, Corporal, get out the small fry. The little ones were assembled in a raid in military line. It was one of the most terrible spectacles I ever saw. Poor kids. The boys of 12 or 13 managed somehow to stand up. The little ones of 8 or 10, no brush can convey the terror of the scene on the canvas. Right? And that's not a Jew talking. Okay? So, very famous. Multiply this 1,000 times, 5,000 times, and you begin to get the idea what I'm talking about. And the Tsar just did it like I'm doing right now. And then he went on to have dinner. You see? And so am I exaggerating? This is a government that's at war with the people. At war with the people. And any regime that could do this against 10-year-old kids. What are we dealing with? And it's the 19th century when everybody's supposed to be enlightened. And Nicholas I has a PR operation which tries to put him out as an enlightened despot. And it's true, it's autocracy. It's remember, I'm the father of my people. God has appointed me to be a spiritual guardian of the Russian people and to run the country in the best possible way. Running the country in the best possible way? Well, the Jews. The Jews. I'm actually doing them a favor because they're too darn culturally insular. You understand what I'm talking about over here? Now, at the same time, Nicholas says, you got to protect the Russians from the Jews. Did you hear what I just said? You got to protect the Russians from the Jews. And so he reduces the pale. There are areas that in there they said now no longer Jews can live there. You got to move out of there because there are already too many Russians over there and you're acting as a bad influence or economic competition with them, all the rest of it. So move back to your area. Now this is Russia, like you just saw. What does it mean move out? Get the heck out of here, right? It could be December. This happened. Get out of here. Move somewhere else. Where do you go? I don't care where you go. Drop dead, Go 20, 30 miles in that direction and then settle wherever you went. Not here. Happened over and over again. Okay? Now, he plans to increase. The guy, till he died, was adding new things. If you read up on him, till he died, he was adding new things. He was now planning to do this in the West. To say, there's a lot of smuggling and things like this happening in the western borders. That's the long border with Germany and Austria. Galicia, Prussia, long border. Too many Jews over there. Let's force all the Jews to move 50 miles inward. Just like that. Just move 50 miles inward. What about my Parnas, all the rest of it? The heck with that movement, like that. Montefiore came to Russia. That's what stopped it. That's one of his famous things. When the Russian Jews heard this, they say he can't appeal to the Tsar. He doesn't have a heart. And so they tried to get the word out to the West. And I remember exactly how they got the word to London. And this is when Montefiore was already famous for having saved the people in the Damascus affair of 1840. And so in 1846, and Montefiore works totally within the system. He applied for a passport from the Russian ambassador and so on and so forth. But let's put it this way. He blocked this through publicity because Nicholas hates publicity. When he went to St. Petersburg, he went in a very public way. He went from Prussia, he crossed up through Lithuania, Balkans, with that famous chariot. What am I thinking of? Coach of his, with the Hebrew and all the rest of it. Very famous story. And you can't treat him and his wife like you could treat the Russian Jews. Okay? They were high society people. Okay? And now he wasn't friends with Queen Victoria like some people said, but he was very good friends with Palmerston, as we'll see, right? Palmerston hates the Tsar. Okay, in fact, he actually took him down in the end, Lord Pan. But when he visited St. Petersburg in 1846, the emperor had to receive him, and he said, if the Jews were all like you, but I'm dealing with riffraff over here. I just want you to understand who we deal with. What a liar, a son of a gun. The Jews here are all riffraff. What are you doing to 8-year-old kids? And the Jews are riffraff. Yeah, you have no idea. It's a total lie. Total evil. Okay? And no, Montefiore didn't care. Let's go to the next one. I want you to see something. This is the painting of Queen Victoria getting married to Prince Albert. There's Montefiore with the yarmulke. Okay? So, the bottom line is that particular gezerah didn't go through, but 10 others did, 20 others did. The Jews are one of the largest single minorities in Russia. There are 3 million of them, and they're dangerous because they have foreign connections. See, the trouble with the Jews is they get guys like Montefiore. That shows they're enemies of Russia. They got a foreigner to come in here to make a big deal just go to the Jewish. Yeah, and what are you doing to 8-year-old kids? That's okay. This is a problem the Russian nationalists will have down till the current time. Why can't the Jews be like the Chechens that nobody ever heard of? Like the Kalmyks never heard. Then Russia can do whatever they want to them. The Jew, you harm one Jew to make a publicity. What are we supposed to do? What else do we have? What other tool do they have? So Montefiore was the best you could do in 1846. You get it? But that makes the Russians hate it even more. Right? So the Jews had to go, as we come to the conclusion, 30 years of this guy, 1825, 1855, Nikolai I. Finally, in 1855, the Crimean War broke out between England and France on the one side and Russia, and Palmerston took them down. That's exactly what happened. Palmerston took them down because the Russian army was completely humiliated. What seemed like a big, powerful country turned out to be hollow. The emperor ran the country very poorly. The army was only good for parade drills. There was unbelievable corruption at every level of the army. So the British and the French landed an army in Crimea. The Russians couldn't stop them. The British beat the Russians and captured Sebastopol, which was the main Russian base. The Russians couldn't stop them. So this is unbelievable humiliation. Nicholas I was so angered by all this, he dropped dead. Okay? And everybody was crying. Now, well, they were all crying, but some were crying this way. Now, as a result, then that's what took him down. Palmerston was the Prime Minister of England when it happened. So Alexander, his son, became the Tsar. Alexander II. There's the fifth one the Jews helped. Well, they got Catherine, they got Paul, Alexander, Nicholas, and now Alexander II. For the next, 25 years or so? Now, when he becomes the Tsar, he realized that his father had gone too far. Russia still has slaves, 20 million slaves, serfs. They have no railroads. You can't breathe. Anybody says anything about politics gets arrested and sent to Siberia. I mean, anybody. The country was about to blow up. Change is absolutely necessary. When he was anointed Tsar, he says, I'm going to introduce reforms. He had to even say it. The question, of course, is how much? So there's a tug of war between the advisors and officials. How many want to liberalize, how many against liberalization. But at least he had two sets of advisors. His father only had one set of advisors. How can we stick it to the Jews even more? Alexander and his company, as I'll try to explain next time, do enact reforms, but it's out of an 18th century sensibility of enlightened despotism, not a 19th century sense of liberalism. You understand? They will change here and change there, make things more efficient, not to make things better, if you follow. So it's true, Alexander II is famous for completely changing the court system from a mess to an honest court system. They did. And the military is overhauled, if you're interested in that. The slaves are eventually emancipated in 1861. He did that. There's some freedom of the press, which is just unheard of under his father. The question becomes like this. So now, are there any modifications in the policies towards the Jews? Stay tuned next time. Good night. Yeah, we'll dive in 2 minutes or something.